Well, good evening, First Baptist Church of Jasper, Georgia. It's Wednesday night, and on Wednesday night, we gather together and just talk. And last week we began a 4-week study on the faith of our colonies. Last week we talked about Virginia, South Carolina, and the Peach State, Georgia. And so today we were going to be looking at the northern Puritan colonies, where the Puritans had a very strong influence and effect. And there were other groups within there, but the Puritans were the biggest. So a lot of these colonies in New England were founded with religious motivation, where, in the southern colonies, Georgia was founded as a debtor's colony and as a buffer for the Spanish. But the other colonies, as much as religion was a part of it, as faith was, that they were created for these folks who had these economic interests, wanted to develop land, grow crops. And so one of the first group was the Plymouth Plantation. This was a group of people dissidents who were in England, moved to the Netherlands, and had this idea of a community that was based on religious principles. They had faced some hardship, some persecution because of their tradition that they had within England. And so they had formed an agreement with this Virginia company to come in, and this company needed settlers, needed to come in, people to help develop an economy, but they were also fine with their strong Puritan influence and had that within their Virginia company. That 101 settlers set out on the Mayflower. Many of us remember that, talking about the Mayflower as children. However, as they moved west to the New World, instead of coming to Virginia, they landed a little bit north in Massachusetts. But as they got there, they organized and they formed a political body that was under the King of England, but they had the power to govern themselves. Created the Mayflower Compact. And as they settled Plymouth, they dealt with a lot of sickness, a lot of death. It was hard that first year, and they wouldn't have survived without the natives and other Europeans who came in who brought supplies. There was also another group of English Puritans that came and formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They also established, it was under the King of England, but it was their own independent. They kind of governed themselves. But there were over 1,000 settlers that came and lived among this area. And even though the Church of England was there a little bit, these people were fleeing. A lot of these settlers from England were fleeing religious persecution, harassment from the Church of England, and were Puritans. And they not only were in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they were also in Connecticut and what at the time was New Haven. Whenever, and of the Puritans too, they had those laws we talked about last week. I mean, they had, you had to adhere to the Sabbath. You had to attend worship. It was mandatory. There was rules for dress. There was rules for language. There was a lot of rules that were set. And it was interesting because the government and the church were, a lot aligned. It's similar to Europe too. So in that setup where you had Catholic countries, you had Protestant countries, and the government and the religious authorities were interlocked with one another. So within these communities, there's often disagreements, just like in all the other ones. And there were some theological controversies, as you will talk about in some of the other colonies too. But one of those controversies that was within the Puritan was membership. How is a person considered a member within the Puritan church? Well, as a baby, you were baptized. And once you were baptized, as you became a young adult, that you would make a public profession of your faith to the church community. That allowed you to be a full member. Well, the challenge is that there were some within the Puritan church who were baptized, who as they became adults, and young adults, they never made a public profession of faith. So there was this tension as these people who never made a public profession of faith, as they tried to interact in the life of the church, as they tried to help make decisions. The folks who were actually adults who had professed their faith wanted to push, said that they couldn't have a say, and so there was a lot of headbutting, I guess you would say. And then there was another layer to that, is when some of these folks who were baptized never professed publicly as a young adult that their faith was in Christ, that they began to have children. So the conversation was, do we baptize these children or do we not baptize these children? And so because of that, there was a lot of, I guess you would say, statements, what we would call confessions, written out about the church, really kind of cementing how they were going to do church. Do these members have a say? Do they not have a say because they're not quote unquote full members? And so there was a lot of tension, challenges, a lot of conversations about that. But a lot of these churches that were Puritan based were ruled congregationally. So, like us as Baptists, we are congregational. We decide things as a congregation, as a body. There's not another entity that kind of comes in and influences the decisions. Can't talk tonight, that we might make. Another controversy is one that y'all probably have remembered or heard before. You talked about it in school, was the Salem witch trials of 1692. So now, this wasn't the only time witch trials happened within the Northeast or other parts of it, but this is one that's just become well-known, documented, that happened in Salem. But it was a time when there were accusations of young girls practicing witchcraft, and when it happened, it caused hysteria. The people in the community became fixated on this, and because of that, there was a lot of accusations toward one another. They're a witch, this person's a witch, and 20 people were hung, 14 females, 6 males. And some of those people who were accused actually practiced witchcraft, while there's some that didn't, that were hung or either put in prison, and they stayed in prison until they passed away. And some accused others to remove the spotlight off of an accusation on themselves, or just to deflect accusations altogether, saying, well, this person's that and this person's that. But it began to kind of grow out of control. And there was probably a lot, communities have disagreements, and there were times where probably people used past disagreements and used this opportunity when a lot of the people were accusing one another of practicing witchcraft, that they brought up old arguments and were able to say that person was practicing witchcraft, which was against what the Puritans believed. And so it began to grow out of control, and accusations even went to the clergy. The ministers in town were practicing, this, and wealthy merchants were accused, and even the governor's wife was accused of practicing. And at this point, a lot of the authorities said, this is enough. This is enough. This has gotten out of hand. We're just going to put this to bed. No more of this. No more accusing anyone of being a witch. of practicing witchcraft. So as we talked about last week, the idea of when the settlers came to the area, we talked about how they interacted with the Indians. Some traded with them, some worked with them, some wanted the Indians to work for them as slave labor or as paid labor. Some took Indian land, and some of this happened within New England, that there was a lot of interest in interacting with the natives. There was one man named John Eliot, and in 1646 he believed that the Native Americans were of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and bringing these Native Americans to faith in Jesus would fulfill some ancient prophecies. So there was this push to share the faith with these natives, and as they shared, there were quite a few that actually came to faith and following Jesus, and as they came to that faith, they were invited. I don't know if they were invited or if they were made to live in these villages, or they were encouraged to live in these villages where they were ruled according to the law of Moses. I mean, there's a lot of laws as we go back into the Old Testament, Leviticus and Numbers. There's a lot of laws to be governed like that. But they were taught European style of farming, lifestyle, and reading, and taught them to study the Bible. But there were 14 villages created for these Native Americans who came to be followers of Jesus. Well, 1675 comes along. King Philip is King of England, and the Indians, the Native Americans within New England, there were some that began to protest and appeal to King Philip, by how the European settlers were interacting with them. In a lot of ways of neglect, a lot of ways of just a lot of things they were bothered by some of the behaviors of the European settlers, and also they were beginning to take a lot of the native land. And because the Indians appealed to King Philip, a war happened. And King Philip's war erupted in the colonies in this area. But many of the Indians, Native Americans who were a part of John Eliot's villages, many of them took the side of the settlers and fought against the other Native Americans. And then there were some of those Native Americans within those villages of John Eliot's that that just abstained from fighting altogether. But in the hysteria of war, that many of those Indians within those villages that actually fought against the natives, and even the ones who didn't, those Native Americans were rounded up and either killed or taken to an island off of Boston Bay. And so that's just kind of wrapping up the New England colonies, northeastern colonies. I can't talk tonight. So, but that kind of wraps it up a little bit. As you can see that these folks, understandably, wanted to be able to practice their faith in freedom, and which is honorable, and did a lot of good things. But at the same time, they were humans, and there were some things that mistakes or hard moments or disagreements that happened, and I think that we can look back at these and take with us, not just to learn an identity of where we come from, but just learn from these people and the good things that they did, but also the mistakes that we learn from those, and it shapes us as we carry forward, as we walk going forward, how we can be people of faith and still learn from our brothers and sisters of faith in the past. So next week we'll continue on, and we'll talk about Maryland and Rhode Island, and talk about those colonies, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Baptist, about where we came from, and begin to see the influence of our part of our faith tradition. So hope you join me. Hope this is educational. You can read about this and read more if it interests you, and send me some messages and over Facebook, over the church Facebook, and I love this stuff about history, and but I look forward to seeing you next week on Wednesday night. Alrighty.